Hello, I'm Nicholas Thompson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Wired. Welcome to day 2 of Wired 25. Every time I see that video, I've now seen it a couple times, it makes me nostalgic for the time we could all sit with Chris Evans and Susan Wojcicki and Johnny Ive and killer robots. And now we're all kind of being beamed in like Edward Snowden in that trailer. It's a moment where we all crave real human connection, but this is the best we can do. These conferences, these conversations. And we had a fabulous, fabulous one last week. We've got a fabulous, fabulous lineup today. So I'd like to thank our sponsor, Vonage, for making this possible. I'd like to thank you all for being here. And I think we're going to have a really good program. The theme last week was culture, cultural icons. A lot of the conversation, as I mentioned at the end, centered around empathy, using our art and our work to understand other people, to show people what we do, to help connect the world in a way that counters all the different ways that we're getting fractured and split apart. And the theme this week is similar but different. It's resilience. It's the ability to withstand all of these pressures. And this is a perfect week to be doing it because this is the week we honor Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who, as we do this, is lying in state in Washington, D.C. And if there's any word that encompasses her life, it's resilience. You know, her many years working in the law, her many years as a justice, all that she overcame. She famously said that in any good marriage, it helps to be a little deaf. Right? Take constructive criticism, but when something gets a little loud, when something is a little obnoxious, when something is trying to distract you, you just keep pressing ahead and you keep pressing forward. And she did that until the very end of her life. So it is the perfect theme, resilience, for today. We have a whole bunch of conversations about resilience in tech, making our community stronger, making everything about our lives stronger. We're going to kick it off with Sarah Friar and Lauren Goode. So let's begin there. Over to you, Lauren.
Anyone know a babysitter?
We do.
I got you.
I'm looking for a handyman.
I know a good guy for a fence.
Can someone help us fix our water heater?
I can help with that.
Does anyone know a good gardener?
Yeah, I got one.
Where can I find a decent cupcake around here?
I'm going to Delights by Don after this.
Don makes the best cupcakes.
Anyone hungry?
Oh, delicious.
Looking for the best on your block? Tap into your neighborhood.
Wow, look at all the people without masks. Like Nick, I kind of feel a little bit nostalgic for those times for sure. That video must have been recorded in the before times. I'm Lauren Goode. I'm a senior writer at Wired. I'm also the host of the new Get Wired podcast, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be welcoming Sarah Friar to our virtual WIRED25 event this year. Sarah has a long, impressive career in tech and finance. She's worked for Goldman Sachs, Salesforce. She was the chief financial officer of Square for several years, and now she is the chief executive of Nextdoor. She also sits on the boards of Walmart and Slack. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today in our virtual environments.
Lauren, thank you. It is such a delight. And I too was having those same feelings of nostalgia of getting together in real life. And that's what we all love about our neighborhoods.
Absolutely. And in years past, of course, we would do this event in real life, but now we're doing this and we hope to bring you some really great programming and some great conversations. So for those of you who don't know, what we just saw was an ad for Nextdoor, and there are probably some people listening who aren't on Nextdoor or are a little bit familiar with it. The comparison I most often hear when people say, what is Nextdoor? Someone says, well, it's kind of like Facebook for your neighborhood. And I think that has a lot to do with the design of it, you know, the fact that it's new. But I would love to hear your thoughts on that comparison and particularly how you feel being compared to Facebook in a time when our relationship with Facebook is a little bit fraught.
Sure. So for those of you not using Nextdoor, Nextdoor is the neighborhood hub. It is the place to go to tap into what's going on locally. And of course, we know that local has never been more important as people are staying at home, working from home, and have seen so much of the need to reach out during this crisis. to the people that live around them, Nextdoor is the way to do that. So if you're not on the platform, please come join us. In terms of the comparison to other social media platforms, we do think we're very different. Our purpose at Nextdoor is to cultivate a kinder world where everyone has a neighborhood to rely on. And so we really think of ourselves as the humane platform, the place where people are really coming together for good. In order to do that, we are bringing together people who don't already know each other. It's a very different graph. So it's not your friend graph. It's not your professional graph. It is literally the people who have what they have in common with you is proximity. And in times of crisis, that's actually incredibly important because those are the people that can show up at your door and go grab a prescription. There are people like me who are privileged to be healthy, who can go out and go to the supermarket for, say, an elderly neighbor. And we think it's important that you're not in a thought bubble. You are literally meeting people who are very diverse and different from you and sharing opinions and starting to garner empathy for one another.
And one of the things that you've said in the past, too, is that one of the differentiators is that you authenticate people in a different way when they join the platform. You're verifying them in a certain way. Talk a little bit about how that happens and also ultimately how you grow a business like that when there are these intentional barriers put up to people joining the community.
Yes, so we always say Nextdoor was founded in trust. So as you just noted, we do take the time to verify that you're a real person at a real address. There's no bots, there's no fake people, no avatars or trolls, because you're really there with your real name. And that's important because that starts to build trust and accountability. So that is a big part of our ethos. You're right that there are times when we will take the road less trodden. So it isn't just growth at any cost, it's very intentional growth. There are other parts of our platform where we intentionally slow people down. In fact, as we see conversations get more heated, we often will interject something called our kindness reminder. It's a piece of technology that we worked on with a bunch of amazing social scientists to effectively slow people down, often when they're here in this part of their brain, dinosaur brain, and bring them back up to their frontal cortex where they can think and really work through those biases. And we think it's so important, never been more important, in fact, at a time when people are quite stressed and so therefore potentially more on edge, easier to trigger, that we are reminding them that great neighborhoods are created with kindness. So those are just two examples of things we do that often slow down growth, but we think it's intentional and good growth. And we're still in 268,000 neighborhoods in 11 countries. So it certainly hasn't held us back.
Right. And what you've said in recent interviews is that you have seen a fair amount of growth on the platform since the pandemic started, presumably because people are looking to their neighbors for resources and that sort of thing. But I'm glad you brought up that idea of slowing down. In fact, Wired did a story on Nextdoor back in 2017 about some of the design changes that Nextdoor was making to try to slow people down, and particularly when it came to racial profiling, right? There had been activity spotted, particularly in the crime and safety section of the website, where people were racial profiling. And it's a very real problem on the platform, as it is on many other platforms. And so Nextdoor, as I understand it, instituted these mechanisms to basically get people to stop and say, hey, wait a second, are you sure you want to post that? And now that it's been a few years, and particularly when society is still so divided and divisive, how are you measuring whether or not that's working? How do you measure the success of these tools?
Yes, great questions, because of course we can all make ourselves feel good by doing things, but are we actually showing real material results? And as you point out, that division and divisiveness and things like racial profiling are problems in society, and so they will expose themselves onto virtual environments too. If you take something like racial profiling, so for a start, we've even changed the name. We only talk about safety now. We've removed the word crime because we think that triggers a particular thought process. We worked with some great academics, including Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt out of Stanford. If you all haven't read her book, Biased, at a minimum, listen to her TED Talk, because she talks exactly about the science behind slowing people down. And so as we have measured that impact since 2015, we now see that 75% less posts are made with racial profiling in them. And then, of course, from there, we of course moderate to make sure that no post, any post is obviously a miss. And so we want to make sure it's not happening. Other examples, we've put in place a neighborhood pledge recently, really reminding people that Nextdoor is a community guideline platform where you do agree, coming to our platform, that you'll be helpful, not hurtful, for example, or that there's no place for hate speech or racism. And just that sign up is often a way that a human will remember, oh, I'm supposed to act in a certain way. And then beyond the kind of stick, there's also the carrot, right? We don't just want to tell people what not to do. It's actually often far more important to norm people to the positive. What is it that works well here, and what do I get rewarded for? And so being able to use actions like a like or a thank you, we often will use personalization to move posts that are really deeply meaningful to neighbors up the stack. And as we create products like groups, we're able to also augment, here are the types of groups that are working well in your neighborhood. I literally just prior to this was listening to a neighbor talking about her walking group in Manhattan. It's a women's only walking group, but she talked about the camaraderie for someone who'd moved from the Midwest, who's quite young, in her 20s, and really just missed human-to-human interaction. So they're socially distanced, walking with masks on, but for her, it was all about the conversation and finding some connection. People are lonely, people are anxious, and they really are trying to find new ways to come together. And you can only do that in an in real life neighborhood way, because you've got to live near people if you're going to walk with them.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like you're seeing some measure of success based on some of the changes you've made around racial profiling. And I'm wondering what it is you would say to folks who are still a little bit hesitant to be on Nextdoor or participate. Maybe they're on, but they don't want to participate because they see a lot of divisive or problematic content or outright racist content that may be extremely upsetting to them. What's your best answer to that right now for people who are still a little bit resistant to the idea of it?
Sure. So I would, first of all, give it a try. Come for the community, right? People often arrive with a utilitarian, something to solve. I need a plumber. I want to know the best place to grab coffee locally. I'd love a play date for my kids. A lot of people are struggling right now with kids at home. But stay for the community and the connectedness. Actually start to see that blossom. And we know what's happening in neighborhoods right across those 11 countries. In terms of, if you're uncomfortable, know that we are moderating. So we use local leads and now local community reviewers. One of the things we heard really in the depths of what was going on around Black Lives Matter right after George Floyd's killing was that people wanted to have more moderation, and they really wanted to see the diversity of their community in those moderators. And so we've actually just launched a new program called Community Reviewers. I have been wowed by how many people have put their hand up to be a community reviewer. And one thing we know for sure is the more that we get newer members into those community reviewer roles, the better, because newer members tend to be much more representative of their community at large, rather than, say, maybe our founding members. We love them too, but we love that our newer members tend to be more representative. So we think Nextdoor has changed a lot for the better, even in the last couple of years. So if you've tried us before, maybe come back and take a look again, because your neighborhood needs you.
Sorry about that. My cat just decided to join. My cat wants to be a part of the community.
Cats are very welcome on Nextdoor. We find a lot of them.
Yeah, he wants to know what's going on with the neighborhood cats. So, so you bring up content moderators, which is a really important topic these days. And you probably saw recently that YouTube, after saying back in March was going to rely a little bit more on AI to moderate some problematic content, just went back to humans. It turns out humans were very valuable in the jobs that we do. And so I'm wondering what you think. And it sounds like you're relying heavily on humans too, people in the community, to moderate content. So I'm wondering what you see the future of content moderation being on platforms like yours. Like, do we swing back towards AI once the technology gets better? Do content moderators finally become a valued and highly paid role in technology? What does the future look like?
Sure. So we view it as a layered cake, and there's 3 layers in my cake right now. The first is where I started, which is that moderation happens at a local level. And we think it's really important because only the people who live in that neighborhood actually have local context, right? It's very hard to imagine how a company in Silicon Valley could possibly be moderating my dad's neighborhood in Northern Ireland with no context for what it's really like to live in that rural community. So that's kind of step 1. And as I said, we're broadening those roles. So today, a lot of the focus is content moderation, but our leads also fulfill many other roles. Like they're often the welcome wagoner. They're often the person that might get a community together around, say, local businesses. So we're also expanding how we think about roles over time. So that's kind of layer 1. Layer 2 is technology. I never want to say technology is the solution to all ills, but it can have a very scalable part to play. And so clearly we do use machine learning to be able to spot, for example, when a conversation is starting to heat up, a machine can spot quickly that that's happening. So things like sentences get shorter. They start losing all punctuation. Often they might move to all caps, for example. And that might be a great time to remind mid-flight to slow down, so interject something like our kindness reminder, but it might also be a great time to suggest a group, because we know that for some people, they are really, really passionate about, say, civic engagement in their local neighborhood, but not everyone wants to talk about the new zoning law. And so that's a time when technology might flip you over into a group, for example. And then, of course, the third layer of my 3-layer cake is internal moderation at Nextdoor. We have a neighborhood operations team, and in particular for maybe some of the most controversial topics, things like discrimination and racism, they go directly to our neighborhood operations team because we want to make sure that people that are perhaps most sophisticated in that review are taking a look at content that could be most problematic. So always more to do. It's a journey. It's like security, which I used to cover a lot back when I was an analyst at Goldman Sachs. You are never done. The fraudsters or the people that want to create division will always keep finding ways around and to do more, but our job is to stay ahead of them and frankly, to keep bringing back to neighborhoods that feeling of kindness and that feeling of why when neighborhoods are strong, really good things happen.
What would you say is the most interesting thing that you've learned about people on Nextdoor during the pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm actually going to go back pre-pandemic where I literally went to every country that we are in, or I went to 10 out of 11. I didn't go to Italy, unfortunately, which was a miss. And what I heard that surprised me is actually a little negative. I heard a lot of people talking about loneliness and social isolation. And it wasn't just, say, seniors in a community or say a young mom who for the first time is home with a baby. It was coming across every neighbor almost that I met with, regardless of age or whether they worked or didn't work, male or female. And so that actually started a lot of research and work that we've now continued through the pandemic. We are currently surveying neighbors in Australia, the UK, and the US. I'm working, frankly, with some of the best academics on this topic of loneliness and social isolation. One of the first findings is that if you know 6 neighbors or more, hopefully, but 6 is the magic number, you are much less likely to suffer from that feeling of being isolated or that anxiety that comes with it. So turns out neighbors are good for your health. And it also does align with our former Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, came up with the best tagline, which is loneliness is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes per day. So I do think that there is going to be a global trend, particularly through COVID, because we're having our own social experiment right now of being trapped in our own little boxes without a lot of real human-to-human connection, about just the negative impact that can have and how we all need to kind of fight the other way. Local is an easy, fast way to do it because you can literally go for a walk, down your street in Manhattan. I can hit a more suburban community here where I live. And even if it's as simple as a quick wave or a greeting, that can really make a difference in someone's life if they're struggling with anxiety and social depression.
Absolutely. Sarah, I think we only have a few minutes left and I have some audience questions that I wanted to ask you. I may only be able to get to one of them. And by the way, that Best of Nextdoor, the Twitter account, told me to tell you hello. For those of you who don't know what Best of Nextdoor is, I recommend you go check it out because they share some of the more interesting Nextdoor stories on Twitter. Let's ask this question coming from Cruz Alvarado. And thank you for sending in your question, Cruz. How do you see the political landscape impacting your decisions on future projects? This is a great question because we talked about divisiveness and we talked about racism. We didn't specifically talk about politics, but of course that's top of mind for a lot of people right now.
Yeah, Cruz, thank you. It's a great question, and it's something I'm spending a lot of time on, as you can imagine, with the US election. And clearly, even last year with Brexit in the UK, it was very top of mind for our UK neighbors. First of all, we should probably just make clear that we don't allow conversations around national politics in the main newsfeed on Nextdoor. We just found it got too divisive, too controversial. So we actually ask the neighbors take that over into a group, and they can found their own group to talk about it, or probably find a group where people do want to talk national politics. On the other side, we think local politics actually has a really big place on Nextdoor. We know that often people come together in their community because they want to be civically minded or civically active. And in fact, that's one of the things that tends to fall away when communities no longer strengthen what are called weak ties. So you're not able to get a group together to say, hey, we want to put, traffic cones on this road because our kids are playing here and we'd like to slow down the traffic. And so we do want that to be a very healthy part of Nextdoor. And in fact, I think it's one of the huge utilities that neighbors get out of it. So it's an interesting nuance of how do we ensure national moves off into a group, but local can really stay in the main newsfeed, because for many people, there's no local news anymore, no newspaper to go to. So it can be the way that they're finding out about what's going on with, say, the local mayor. We also work with a lot of public agencies to make sure the most recent and the best information is really top of mind. And that can be everyone from, say, Governor Newsom here in California, the Mayor of London, Mayor Khan, all the way to FEMA. Right now, we have a lot of tropical storms and hurricanes moving either through Texas or up the East Coast. We have wildfires here in California. And that's a really important place for government and often politicians to be involved, because they're actually providing information that keeps neighborhoods safe.
That makes a lot of sense. I will say that the wildfires have been one of the instances where Nextdoor has been helpful during these times. But it's interesting you talk about sort of creating a section for national politics. I feel like we could have a whole other conversation about that at some point. But I have to wrap this up because we have other great WIRED25 programming to get to. So Sarah Friar, CEO of Nextdoor, thank you so much for joining me today in this virtual WIRED25 event.
Thank you, Lauren. Really appreciate it.
Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Arielle Pardes. I'm a senior writer with Wired, and I am joined today by Arlan Hamilton, the founder and managing partner of Backstage Capital, and Katie Ray, the CEO and managing partner of The Engine. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Hi, now, I could not have asked for two better people to talk to today about my favorite topic in tech, which is the money. We're going to be talking about how we build the stuff that matters, which often comes down to funding the stuff that matters. And that is where both of you come in. So, Arlan, I want to start with you. You founded Backstage Capital almost exactly 5 years ago. And the mission was to invest in underestimated founders. So I want to ask what that word means to you and what kind of opportunity you saw in these underestimated founders that other investors weren't seeing.
Sure. So we celebrated 5 years a week ago today. So underestimated is actually a term that was gifted to me by one of our founders 3 years ago during our second year anniversary. And it just speaks to the difference between thinking of Black and Brown founders and women in general at founders as a charity or competition. And what we want people to hear when they hear underrepresented or underestimated is that's your competition. That's someone or a group of people who have been overlooked and discounted but it's not to say that they're not on par with you, and maybe in some cases even beyond your reach, and are lapping you, in fact. And so 7 or 8 years ago, when I was looking into the world of Silicon Valley and other tech hubs, which were few and far between at the time, when I came across the statistic that 90% of venture funding goes to straight white men, and they make up a third of the country, it didn't make any sense to me. And so I started looking around as a gay Black woman, thinking, well, first thought was that sucks, because where does that leave me? But then it really quickly turned into, what an opportunity, what a gift that so many people are overlooking us and taking us for granted, to be honest. And so my thought was, if we have done so much with so little, as I've seen so many of us do, what would happen if we were given more? If we had that slight chance that was not afforded to us prior. And so first I went out asking people to do this, and then once I realized it was falling on deaf ears, I said, I'll attempt it myself. And so I put together a few $1 million from scratch to do that over the years.
I love that idea of, if people have been working on so little because they're so underestimated, what would happen if you gave them more? And I want to return to that concept because I think it's really powerful. But Katie, you're also reaching a slightly different set of founders and companies with your fund, The Engine, though, as I understand it, your founders and companies often need more to do more. They need more upfront capital. They need more time in their development cycles. And so I want to ask you the same question. What was the opportunity that you saw as an investor in taking a chance on some of the companies that you've invested in?
Yeah, so if you take a look at what The Engine does, we back really transformational technology that could shape a market and solve a huge world problem all in a go, right? But it requires patience, it requires capital, and it requires imagination on how to get these types of companies to market, right? It's not just straight software. So if you're gonna change the world's energy grid to be carbon free, you only have a few transformational technologies that could work to do that. So you have to reach back into, the best universities in the world. We're partnered with MIT, and look at how could that happen, and then back founders to do that. But it means that your timeframes to market are often, 10 years, not 2 or 1 or 0. And it means that you could potentially be having to raise, $100 million first round, not 1 to 2. So that means that you have to be creative about the capital raising, creative about how to back companies like this. But the opportunity, the economic opportunity, is enormous. But you have to have the wherewithal to pull that all together. And so that's what we do at The Engine. And, we back founders coming out of PhD programs, postdocs, professors who have created these real breakthroughs across many, many industries, whether it's decarbonization of the energy grid or how we can truly extend human life in meaningful ways to a very large set of the population, or how we're better connected. So we think of that as advanced systems. All of those are really important for our planet and under invested in because they look more complex, or it's not in the regular playbook. But we're psyched that we have that opportunity, and we think we'll make a ton of progress for the planet, but also returns for our investors.
I'm very glad that you brought that up because neither The Engine nor Backstage Capital are charities. You are not philanthropists, you are investors. And so you're investing in people and companies that you think will make a difference, but you're doing so to get returns. And we often see investors, especially in venture capital, sidestepping the kinds of founders and startups that you're interested in. because they fear that they won't make money. I actually just saw this week the global head of technology at Deutsche Bank was quoted saying, "Rarely in my investment career do I see what's good for society is also good for investment returns." And so I wanted to ask each of you, what is wrong with that perspective? What have you seen through your funds that proves that maybe you actually can make money by investing in diversity, investing in social good, investing in tech that changes the world?
One thing to note when it comes to venture is I think just in the last month or so, they released, someone released data, I think it was PitchBook or Crunchbase, that said something like 2/3 of all venture funds return 1x or less over their 7 to 10 year period. And so one way of framing it is that, being safe so far is not really working. If for no other reason, getting outside of the color lines, no pun intended, is interesting for someone who's being competitive or who looks at trends, or in the same way that people look at other trends like cryptocurrency and things like that. Just to take an academic critical look at it rather than dismissing it all in. And then, of course, anecdotally, I'm surrounded by people, absolutely surrounded by people in our portfolio, more than 100 companies, so 250, 300 founders total, who have been overlooked. And I believe good 20% of them will go on to either in this company or the next lead unicorn companies if they want to. They're creating impact now, and we're talking about what is it, 2030 or 2040? I don't know exactly right now, but at some point we're going to be a majority minority. And so we're going to have to we have to start now to speak to that audience. And it just, the past 10 years, everything that Black and brown people who have been paying attention have predicted has come true. And I think this year is like a culmination of that. It's come to a head. And to overlook it now is just at the investor's peril.
And maybe one thing to add to that, totally agree, is that, if you talk to people, the young people of today, just go out to the universities and, people of every race, class, gender, what you hear so often is, we want to do good. And so if you just follow the youth in what will be, they want to be on a mission that is good for our planet, good for other people. You're going to make money by being aligned. I'm sorry, the youth always know. So you just sound old when you say that.
Yeah.
When you say, oh yeah, you can't make money by doing good, you're just old. Retire.
Right. I guess
that's how I feel about it.
You also can't make money if we don't have a planet or a functioning society or many of the other things that I think we're grappling with very much this year. And Katie, I know many of the companies that are in your portfolio are focused on future-proofing in a very literal way. We're trying to build things that ensure that there is a future in which we can make money as investors. Actually, I have an audience question for you, Katie, which is sort of on those lines, which is how do you get policymakers to invest in low probability, high impact scenario preparation? So when we're thinking about risk and how important it is to invest in understanding those risks and preparing for them, how do you get policymakers to consider that as well?
Well, it's a great question, and it's something we spend a lot of time on because, we don't have an educated Congress about science and technology. We only have 3 people in Congress with a science or technology degree. and they are woefully understaffed in their understanding of what's actually happening. And so, and not because they're not good people and wouldn't want to set good policy for the future. I don't believe that at all. So that means that it's incumbent upon, people with that knowledge to really work with the folks that will set policy. And so there's a quite a large group of people that do that, but it requires really education. I mean, look at climate change. We still have people negating that. Okay, so California's burning, people. I mean, that was a real wake-up call. Go to Miami, look at all the basements, they're flooded. The sea is rising. There's no way around not acknowledging that, yet we still don't. So, we all have to continue to educate those that will make policy, but we also on the venture capital side and the entrepreneurship and innovation side have to also show the way. What's the capital needed? Why is that capital needed? How do you establish these industries that will do good? And so you have to put forth and help the policymakers really see what's going on. It's not their fault that they don't know this deep science, and so it's a collaboration that needs to happen.
Yeah, and I love this idea of modeling that through your investments and through the work that you do. We just have a couple of minutes left, but I did want to acknowledge that this year has been a huge wake-up call for not just issues of disaster preparation, but also, Arlan, I know you're seeing, just as of this year, a huge surge in interest around funding diverse founders, Black and Brown founders in particular. And so I was wondering if you could sort of leave us with some thoughts about how we take this energy into the future and ensure that the founders and companies that are underrepresented right now are the ones that we're paying more attention to in the future. What have you seen from this year that can be telling about how we get more money into the hands that need it going forward?
Yeah, I think, this summer has just been very interesting. Phone has been ringing off the hook in a way that, as we haven't changed, I haven't changed, but circumstances have. And to me, it's not a cause for celebration. Obviously, it's a very painful time, a traumatic time for so many people. And for me also, time will tell. This can't be a moment. It has to be a movement, and it has to stand the test of time, because already, even already there's been, I would say, 40 to 60% drop off in the interest since June, because people's attention span and stamina is just so lacking when it comes to anything that's uncomfortable or different or outside of their comfort zone. And the people who are still in the fight, even large corporations, some of them have been able to stay in the fight, and really, beyond the headlines and beyond the hoopla, have really said, what do we do? And are learning from the people who have been in the trenches this whole time. And it wasn't a wake up call, by the way, to Black people. This what you're referring to, it was not a wake up call to us. We've been woke for the entire time. So the people who were jolted awake really should stay awake, do what it takes. I won't call out a energy drink because I don't know who your sponsors are, but do what it takes, right? Stay awake and make it a durable, sustainable part of the fabric of your companies and internally. And that's, that starts internally too, with really looking at who you have on your teams, how you're representing yourselves outwardly, how are people who are looking for jobs, do they feel included based on what they see of your company so far? There's a lot that can be done, and there's so many people who already do this work who you can tap into rather than trying to reinvent the wheel.
I love that. Arlan, Katie, I could talk to you for another hour, but unfortunately that's all we have time for. But thank you so much for taking the time today, for being part of our WIRED25, and for sharing those insights.
Thanks
Thank you so much.
Nice to
Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Simon. I am a science journalist at Wired. Welcome to the WIRED25 panel on big global environmental challenges, which sounds very intimidating and a bit heavy, but I promise we're going to focus a lot on some solutions here and also on some very fascinating research. So with that, I wanted to introduce our panelists. First of all, we have Dee and Steve Allen. They are microplastic researchers extraordinaire, the dynamic duo of microplastic research, if I must say. And Isla Meyer-Smith, she is a global change ecologist. Thank you, everybody, for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Great, thanks for having us.
Sure. Steve and Dee, you are on a boat, and I bring that up because it's relevant. Last time we talked a few months ago, you were in a caravan in the Scottish countryside, and I could hear sheep in the background. You're globetrotters. You're globetrotters for very good reason, because of the what you're studying. Walk us through what you're doing out there on boats and in caravans.
Well, we survived the initial COVID lockdown in a caravan at a friend's place with many, many sheep. But now we've returned to the middle of France on the Rhone River on our boat, just waiting for all the madness to stop so we can carry on with the research.
So what is microplastics? How do you define that? And I think this is a good way to start to talk about your research. Where are you finding these tiny bits of plastic?
Everywhere. So our research focuses on atmospherics. We went about looking up in the air purely because we found plastics in the oceans. Plastics has been found in the rivers, in the river sediment. It's being found in soil. And we're still not finding that mass balance equality in the plastics that we would expect. So we have an idea of how much is being thrown out, how much is being lost out of the waste management system, but we don't know where that missing gap is between the amount that we know is actually being put to waste and the amount that's being produced. There's a gap. So it's a leaky system. We don't have a circular economy. And we want to know where all of that plastic has gone. And the last environmental compartment to look at is the atmosphere. So we started looking up in the atmosphere or in the air that's floating around you all the time. We started in France, and we've sort of moved globally to identify where these microplastics might be. Microplastic is a slightly contentious term. It depends on who you talk to as to what size it is. It's basically anything that's under 5 millimeters in size, all the way down to 1 micron, and then below 1 micron is a nanometer, which is a nanoplastic. So that's not a medical definition, that's a scientific definition.
Yeah, and you're finding these tiny bits of plastics on remote mountaintops, and it's very clear that this is blowing the wind, and it's also blowing up into the Arctic. It has been found in formerly pristine areas up there, and I think that brings us nicely to Isla's research, also looking at the Arctic, but looking at some really troubling things when it comes to climate change, given the fact that the Arctic is warming twice, if not more, faster than the rest of the planet. So Isla, maybe just introduce your research here. And I understand that you actually have some new research that came out this week that you could share.
Excellent, yeah. So I work in the Arctic, and in normal summers, I'm actually up in the Arctic for the last, or I would have been for the last few months, collecting our field research. This summer's been a bit different, but the research continues, this time more at the computer. So I work in the Canadian Arctic, and I work with data sets from around the Arctic, and what we're seeing is this greening of tundra ecosystems. So you have the climate warming over the last few decades, and what we've been doing is monitoring plants on the ground and from the air using drones, and with my research team, which is called Team Shrub, tracking this change that's going on in the high latitudes of the planet. And so we're using fixed wing plane drones, we're using the multi-copter drones, some of the same kind of drone platforms that you could buy commercially or fly yourself. And then we're monitoring these vast tundra landscapes that have this green surface of plants at the top. And what we're seeing from space, from satellites, is this greening pattern. And what we're trying to figure out on the ground is exactly what that greening signal means in terms of change on the ground and what that means for the carbon cycle, which is all a part of this global climate system, and whether basically warming in the Arctic is going to amplify the climate change that we see across the planet.
Yeah, a couple things that I want to follow up on. Greening sounds nice, generally speaking, but that is not the case in the Arctic. I was hoping you could follow up on a couple of maybe some knock-on effects that we might be seeing ecologically, both in the Arctic itself, but looking at Earth as an Earth system. How might the greening of the Arctic then further feed into these patterns of climate change?
Yeah, so the vegetation change we're seeing in the Arctic is an increase in the plants. So you're up above the tree line, and where you are in the Arctic, we have different species that are sort of shorter than trees, but growing taller over time. So we've got these shrubs in this system, the woody plants that are kind of the trees of the tundra, and then also grasses and other species that can benefit when the temperatures are warmer and the growing seasons are longer. So we think that's what's causing climate change in these systems. And that's kind of the theme of the new paper that you mentioned before that came out yesterday. We were working with higher resolution satellite data and comparing that to change on the ground and also the warming patterns that we've seen in the Arctic. And in that paper, we found that, over 30% of the Arctic is greening. So it is a really pervasive signal. And we think that in some cases that's trapping more carbon in the plants, but it's also changing the Arctic in different ways. So one way is as those shrub canopies get taller, that traps more snow in the winter. And snow acts like a blanket in these systems, and it insulates the ground from the cold temperatures in the air in the wintertime. So it's kind of like on a cold winter day, if you put an extra blanket on your bed, you're warmer. And that's a problem because we don't really want the soil to be warmer in these systems because that allows microbes to keep munching away on the carbon that's in there. It allows the permafrost, which is the permanently frozen ground, to stay warmer in the winter, which means that in the summer it thaws to a deeper level. And all of that could potentially be releasing carbon into the atmosphere. So what we're concerned about in these systems as the vegetation increases is that we might be seeing some positive feedbacks that are going to release carbon to the atmosphere. And there's quite a lot of carbon. So I was trying to look up exactly how much carbon we're talking about in these high latitude systems. And it's somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 petagrams of carbon, which NASA put out this example. So that's, if you imagine a coal train, and each of the coal train has these cars full of coal, and the coal is mostly carbon, the train would be, I think, something like 200,000 miles long. That's the amount of carbon that's in the high latitudes that could be released to the atmosphere. So if it was released, then that could as much as double the atmospheric CO2 concentrations, possibly more. And that would create this feedback that means greater warming, not just in the Arctic, but for the planet as a whole. So the Arctic's warmed by about 2 degrees already, and we're expecting it to warm by 6 to 10 degrees over the next 100 years, maybe more. So all these feedbacks and this change is already happening up there, and we're just trying to figure out how fast and what it'll mean for all of us on the planet.
Yeah. Yeah, and speaking of feedback, Stephen D, I think your research is particularly fascinating because you're covering so much of what we're starting to call the microplastic cycle, the way that these particles are moving between land and sea and air, kind of building off some of the stuff that Isla's talking about, these global systems that are all interconnected. I was hoping you could speak to what we're learning about this microplastic cycle, how these little bits of plastic are actually moving around the planet.
Yeah, I think we often forget that we live on a ball, and that ball is inside a bubble. So there are no borders. Nature doesn't see borders, and certainly pollution doesn't. So whatever we do in one area affects everybody else. And plastic is a prime example of covering long distances. We're still looking for the sources at the moment. We're doing a lot of work on trying to pinpoint that so that we can try and mitigate the problem. But as Isla was mentioning, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is having an effect on the Arctic Circle. And plastic, of course, is a producer of carbon. The whole process, the whole life cycle of plastic, from taking the fracking gas out of the ground, turning into ethylene, from there all the way through to landfill and this imaginary recycling, where it's actually just being shipped off to places like Malaysia, where they either chop it up and burn it or put it straight in the river. It's all, every step along that route is adding to the carbon footprint, but it's also adding to points where it can leak out into the environment. And that's where we're finding it, in the very, very small material.
So part of the work that we do looks at how far it transports, and so we can find where these particles are arriving in the world. So we've got samples from Africa, from France. We've got some samples from the Arctic. We've got places. We've got air samples from all over the world, and everywhere you look, you find plastic. We haven't found a sample that doesn't have any atmospheric plastic. And what you find falling from the down to the ground, and what you find blowing through the air are slightly different. So they're a slightly different particle size. They have slightly different dynamics and shapes and the types of material that they are. But what we can do is, when we know those quantities and we know where we found them, we can then model where this material goes. So you do a back trajectory model and look at its history. And if your samples are taken in the right way, you can actually create a map saying, I caught this sample on this location. So we know that there's pieces of plastic that we potentially are breathing in that are on this location. So they're getting into the ecosystems and we're getting into lungs and things like that in this location. I've taken that sample on that day. I can then map back where it's travelled through time in the air, and then for where it came from, potentially. So there is, moving forwards, a way of not finger pointing, but like identifying the key sources that can be the major contributors to what this atmospheric plastic is.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about this. We actually got a question from a watcher of the series here that I think I just may as well kick to, from Laura Tate. She was wondering, I think both of you can ask this. It's vague enough on a planetary scale. Is it too late to save the planet? If not, what are the top 3 things we can do to stop the destruction of Earth for our future generations? We're closing out here on a couple of last minutes. I hope we can end on a bright note in that way.
I hope we can.
Excellent.
We're not going to give up hope. We're going to keep trying.
I think as a scientist... Go ahead.
For plastics, there are some things we can do.
Go ahead.
Okay. So for plastics, there are some things we can do. Yeah. For plastics, there are some basic things we can do. We use an enormous amount of single-use plastic. If you think about and you value the plastic that you use on a daily basis in a different way, so you identify this as a very high value resource, not something that you use for a single purpose and then dispose of, and if you stop using things in such a linear economy, so you take it, you use it, you throw it, then there is a potential to have a substantial reduction on the amount of plastic pollution that we could have in this world. It requires an awful lot of change in the way that we create and we manage our plastic, but there is positive things that you can do towards it. Unfortunately, the very small pieces of plastic we have in our environment, we can't collect. There is no mechanism for us to filter the air in the world and take all the plastic back out. So what's there, we have to figure out the damage it's doing and the impact it's having and how not to create more. But we can't take that away, unfortunately.
And the same is sort of true for the climate side of the equation. So this is a really big global problem, and each of us as individuals is playing a part in that. So we can lower our own carbon footprints, and as scientists, we can document the change that's going on. But we also need to work together as a planet, as different countries, and encourage our policymakers to really think about enacting meaningful change, reducing carbon emissions. And part of our response as the climate changes is just to adapt ourselves and try to help these ecosystems along as they adapt to these warmer conditions. So the Arctic is changing. It's already changed, but that doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily change in ways that it'll be unrecognizable in the future, but it could be different, and we might need to sort of adapt and deal with that new different Arctic and that new different climate system in the future.
So we have 2 minutes left. Just a quick last question, building off a little bit of that. We hear a lot about things that we can personally do when it comes to climate change and plastic pollution, but neither of those are our problems as individuals. They're corporations that have done this to a large degree. Just very briefly, if all 3 of you might be able to talk about that context. Yes, we can do things individually, but we need to put pressure on the bigger forces here.
Yeah, I think the first thing you can do is your vote. We need to influence the people who have the power to make the changes. Individually, we can do small things to, lessen our plastic use. But really, it's got to come from the top. We need solid policy change. Plastic bag bans and straw bans do not go far enough. We need complete revolution in the plastic industry for a start. Labelling needs to be honest. Bioplastics, we need to prove they're safe before they let them out. Things like that. But really, it's your vote. Contact your politician. Tell them that you care about this issue.
And just building on that, educate yourself about the issues, find out about the Arctic, other parts of the planet, find out the changes that different peoples around the world are experiencing, and share that information, and maybe choose different purchases. Try to buy local, think about the food you eat and the traveling you're doing, and try and limit your own impact on the planet while sharing sort of the changes that are going on and what we as a society can do. So, and I agree, definitely get out and vote.
Okay. I feel like we did the best we could ending this on a rosy note, given the size of these problems. But thanks to all three of you for being here. If any of the viewers are interested in their research, I've written extensively about both of the groups here. It's fascinating stuff, and we'll, of course, be covering what you're doing into the future. So have fun sailing around the world, Steve and Dee, and Isla, thanks as well for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
All right. Bye.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sidney Fussell. I'm a senior reporter for Wired, where I cover big data and policing. I'm joined today by Matt Mitchell. He's a Ford Foundation Tech Fellow and the founder of Harlem, where he works with activist organizers on cybersecurity threats and protecting themselves from surveillance. Matt, how?
Hey, how are you? I'm good.
I'm great. Awesome. Thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us. Could you tell us, just to start off, a little bit about Harlem, which doesn't have anything to do with cryptocurrency?
Yeah, no, I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with cryptocurrency. That crypto stands for cryptography. Although, we do teach everything. So we talk about, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, and we have experts come in like Rick Dudley and things like that. But Crypto Harlem started around the time of the George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin trials. And I just felt like, I wanted to do something. I went to work, and it just seemed like for the few Black folks at work, it was a horrible day. But for a lot of other people, it was just a bad news day. But it was really something that really changed me and changed everyone who I was speaking to in my community of Harlem. And I wanted to do something, so I decided, I'm a computer hacker. I'm a surveillance expert. I can at least talk to folks about the surveillance in our neighborhood and how it got there and how it works and how to circumvent it and the things that we can do to be safer.
Got it. And I know that in your work previously, you've come up with this term, digital stop and frisk. Can you tell us what a digital stop and frisk is and how that relates to your work and people from surveillance?
Yeah, I mean, it's wild out here on these digital streets. And, we had stop and frisk in New York, and that got, it didn't get there's an idea that it doesn't exist anymore and that it got thrown out or banned. Limited use, right? And instead, what we see is a lot of young folks are told by tech companies, post your information on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and express yourself and be you. But for Black folks in the inner city, that is a way that you can get targeted. And law enforcement works with companies that can ingest large amounts of social media traffic and data, do sentiment analysis, and try to use some AI to see this seems angry or this seems about that, create all kinds of networks and causal connections. And it ends up with 6 in the morning, 7 in the morning, your door gets kicked in, you get dragged into the station with hundreds of other young people, right? So there's a pretty well documented case of it in Harlem where I live. And there was a Project Crew Cut and a bunch of other police initiatives where this happens. And it happens to this day. We see protesters in Minneapolis protesters in other parts of the country, in Louisville, etc., being targeted because of social media posts. And yeah, that's what digital stop and frisk is. It's the criminalization of Blackness, but online now instead of on the streets. And it's a lot harder to see. It's a lot harder to, there's no one there to like film this happening to you. And oftentimes it's delayed, right?
Right. And so is that your work with crypto Harlem people from these forms of, discrimination or digital surveillance?
That's exactly what it is. So, a lot of people just don't know that this is a thing, right? So they aren't aware that this is happening. They do see in their neighborhoods, like you go to the inner city from, South Central to Harlem, you go to Chicago, you go to Miami, you're going to find technologies of surveillance in these neighborhoods that you don't see outside these neighborhoods. People aren't always necessarily aware of what these things look like, what they do, how they operate, and how it's used to criminalize their behaviors and target them. I mean, there was a Bloomberg report on persistent surveillance company that has planes just kind of like circling Baltimore, filming live, like what's going on. I mean, if you live in that neighborhood, you're on camera when you go from place to place and do things. And it's just, I think we need to have conversations about like why this is and how it is. And it becomes like it starts with being educated on it. And that's the first thing we do is educate folks on like what's happening. And also, what they can do within their political rights, within their human rights to push back against it.
Got it. And I know you said the sort of origins of Crypto Harlem began with George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin, but certainly, this summer, beginning with the George Floyd protests, we've seen a huge groundswell of grassroots organizations, smaller groups, but also larger ones like the ACLU. And I was hoping you could sort of speak to the sort of bittersweetness of this moment. On the one hand, you have all these, organizations, all these people coming together and being collective, but at the same time, you also have a lot of these, negative groups that are doing things like Zoom bombing and stuff like that. Can you sort of speak to how there's like a lot of good and bad in this very intense, powerful moment?
Yeah, I mean, this is a global movement and moment for civil rights and racial justice, not just in this country, but around the world. But let's not forget that this moment is centered in Black pain and anxiety. And, it is bitter because while there's a lot of attention to these issues, these are issues that have been around for a very long time. Surveillance of Black communities have existed since the slave ships, and it's continued. Methods of surveillance, which are methods of oppression, have continued to evolve since then. It's just gotten very complicated. If you live inside the United States and you're exercising your rights of free speech or your rights to assembly, your rights to, speak out against injustice and protest and march and demonstrate, you might not realize that the entire time for your use of social media, to your physically being at a protest or demonstration, there's a lot of data that you're leaving there and it's being vacuumed up and used to, used against you, right? And I think marginalized people in this country, Black and brown folks, queer folks, anyone who's othered are, targets for this criminalization of their behavior. In this moment of protest, it's important for folks to know what they need to do and how they can not only stay safe at a protest, but as they network and organize and try to make positive things happen.
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right that there's a lot of historical connections beginning with the very foundation of America to this moment. But, again, going back to this moment, beginning with the George protests and the Justice for Breonna Taylor movement, there are some very specific, line things that are being done. You have different people from like Reddit and trolls and things like that doing Zoom, people trying to organize. What are the threats of this current, like Zoom everything COVID moment? What are the things that people can do to protect themselves if they're trying to organize and act and be active and connect?
Yeah, 100%. So, in this moment, a lot of folks are maybe thinking about like law enforcement or some intelligence agency, but it could just be your neighbor or someone who is part of your social circle in real life or online. It just does not agree with your political views. And it doesn't take much for them to disrupt your organizing, what you're trying to do. If you have a video conference, a live stream, whatever technology you're using, it's important for people to understand like how to make that as limited or as possible to be disrupted, right? And how to mitigate all kinds of attacks. Like, you're using Zoom, you got Zoom bombing, and, that'll just ruin you. You're just beginning to start out a grassroots organization. And everyone's so happy to be there. And then all of a sudden you have trolls attacking you and doxing people by posting their personal identifiable information online. The things that you can do are to send, obviously there's some basic things like send that invite to as trusted a list as you can and at as short a notice as you can. You can have people RSVP for the event, but only send the link to people who RSVP'd at a certain time. But then in the technologies, they create things where, people don't just get thrown into a room together. They have to be held in some place or in a waiting room or things like that. And these are all features that it's important for, if you're going to organize and use any technology, it's important for you to take a look at all these different privacy and security sections. The first thing you want to jump into and turn those things on. You want to turn off any kind of personalization in ads. And you also want to look into what is this technology's record of fighting for people's rights who use it. So that's always in this little privacy statement that we always skip, right? It's really important to take a look at that and read it over time because this is real.
Got it. And then, we're wrapping up, but you did say something to me the other day that was fascinating, which was the canaries are screaming. So just with the last minute or so that we have left, what did you mean by that? And what is the sort of message you want people to take away in terms of what they can do going forward?
Yeah, look, when you look at anywhere in the world, you look at any space in the world, there are people who are close to the seats of power and the people who are like centered, the masses, the dominant culture, whatever you want to call that. And the people on the margins who are pushed out there, they don't want to be there. They're pushed out by like a centrifugal force of that, community or culture or country or wherever it is. They are the canaries. When it comes to surveillance, they're the ones who are targeted first. They're othered first. They're beta testers for a lot of technologies. You'll see it where those people gather for prayer or worship or for food or where they live. And it's there where we have to fight because otherwise the momentum will be stacked against us. So if we're going to push back against things like facial recognition, or we're going to push back against things like, weaponizing AI to attack democracies, it begins in Black communities and brown communities and in marginalized communities. They're the canaries in the coal mine and they are screaming, but we're still alive.
Yes, we are. Absolutely. Well, Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today here on WIRED25. And thank you for the work that you're doing. Please continue to protect us and keep us safe as we organize and do everything we can.
Thank you. It's an honor. Thank you, Sydney.
Thanks, Matt.
Mr. President, is it important that people be afraid of you? Fear. Yes. Hello and welcome. I'm Maria Ressa.
Maria Ressa carries the torch of press freedom in a country held in thrall by a populist president.
It started with the drug war.
Do not do drugs because I will kill you.
President Duterte began his administration with the drug list.
This is the drug industry of the Philippines.
He showed everyone a list. People on that list started dying.
I'm telling the Filipino people it's gonna be bloody.
We demanded the government be held accountable.
Duterte was annoyed by our reporting.
You are a fake news outlet. They will be allowed to criticize us, but you go to jail for your crime.
We started getting attacked on social media. The government created disinformation networks, so people have no idea what the truth is. I was getting an average of 90 hate messages per hour.
We don't even know whether we can trust the police to protect us.
Just because you're a journalist, so you're exempted from assassination.
We didn't even realize how dangerous it is for you.
Why are you crying?
Because I'm scared for you.
Maria Ressa has been arrested.
The charges against Ressa were aimed at intimidating those who challenged Duterte's rule.
If I fall, I stand up, break these walls. So why should you care about what happens in the Philippines? They test the tactics of how to manipulate America in our country. If it works, they port it over to the rest of the world.
Maria Ressa was one of 4 journalists named as Time Magazine's Person of the Year.
Maria won't be afraid. I'm afraid for her.
What we're seeing is death by 1,000 cuts. Little cuts of Philippine democracy. We will not duck. We will not hide. We will hold the line.
Hi, I'm so honored to welcome Maria Ressa, the CEO and executive editor of Rappler, to WIRED25. I watched that documentary just last night, and it's fantastic. I suggest people look it up. You could watch it and stream it from your local movie theater. Maria, thanks so much for doing this, especially since it's way past midnight Manila time, isn't it?
It is, but I'm thrilled to be with you, Steve.
Well, thanks. It's Marie and I have met, and it's been great to get to know her during this tumultuous time in her life. Now, I know Rappler has actually been in the news this week, and I want to talk about that. But first, I want to talk about the viewers just saw you getting arrested. What is the situation now with the various arrests and, in one case, a conviction that you've had to deal with from that charming gentleman, Mr. Duterte, that we just saw in that clip?
So I have 8 arrest warrants, right? So 8 criminal charges, and they're fall into 3 buckets. Cyber libel, I was arrested for that. Tax evasion, in order to file these tax evasion charges, the government actually renamed Rappler. We're no longer a news group, we're a dealer in securities. So that's how we now have 5 tax evasion cases against us. And then the last one is kind of the mother case, securities fraud. Where are they? Well, look, I have a filing almost every week. I still spend a big chunk of my time, maybe 80 to 90%, depending on which week it is, on legal cases. Just this week, Monday, I was supposed to testify to fight for my right to travel. That didn't happen. In fact, the government tried to expunge anyway, this is all still ongoing. And I guess the only thing I can say is, we keep fighting every step of the way. I fight for my rights. I fight for Rappler's rights. It is a press freedom issue, and the legal acrobatics to bring us there. Well, I guess the one word to describe all of it, and I think about this all the time now, is I feel like Joseph K. in the trial. It's Kafkaesque.
You know, I thought about that when I just read about the way, particularly that cyber libel case went through. You know, tell us just like a little bit about it, because it just seems so incredibly dicey, you know, how they brought that particular case against you.
So I was convicted along with a former colleague, Ray Santos. He no longer works for us. He actually went to work for government after he left Rappler, right? So we were convicted on June 15th, and I could go to jail for up to 6 years for a story that was written 8 years ago that I didn't write, didn't edit, had no supervision over it, for supposedly violating a law that didn't exist at the time that we published it. And in order to even get us there, this cyber libel law, to get us to court, they actually had to change the statute of limitations of libel from 1 year to 12 years, and then also come up with a novel interpretation of republication for digital. All of these redefinitions will have an impact on Filipinos who are posting on social media. Now they could be sued for libel for up to 12 years. Having said that, we are appealing it, and I have 2 levels of appeals to go up to the Supreme Court. I won't give up.
Right. And you told me recently the total possible jail time that you could serve for this is what?
All the 8 cases that we're facing, and it took the international lawyers, it took Amal to actually tell me how many. It's almost 100 years total, cumulative sentences of these 8 criminal charges. I hope I stay alive that long.
That's incredible.
Sorry, I do laugh about it now, because it's almost, I guess it's kind of gallows humor. How do you deal with it? It's unbelievable, and I laugh.
How do you deal with it? Actually, just laughing? I mean, there's more to it than that. There's some emotional moments in that documentary, and every time I see you, you're always so upbeat, and every time I leave. And then talking to you, I'm about to slash my wrists because it's so disturbing what's happened to you.
I guess
So you play with your own fear. It's in your head, and I just remember that all the time. And we talk amongst ourselves in our team, right? So how do I think of the worst case scenario of whatever it is, and then I imagine how I would deal with it. I embrace my fear, and if I really hold it tight, then I can rob it of its power over me. And this goes to everything. This is also kind of the way that I run Rappler, right? We have to embrace our fear and then go beyond that. We workflow our responses to our fear. So what's the worst case scenario? Let's figure it out, break it down, and then drill it. Like, for example, in the film, you see Pia Renada, our reporter at the palace. She follows Duterte, right? Followed until we were banned. Anyway, we had actually just drilled right a few days before she was banned from the palace what we should all do if we get harassed or if you're prevented access. And we had it down to it, pulling out your cell phone, what things needed to be set up on your cell phone, and how many steps does it take for you to go live. And you go live. And, one of the things she told us after that was that when it happened, she had just drilled it like a day or so earlier, and it worked. So that's it. It's like, I guess it's games with yourself as well, because the world is doing things you can't control. So you figure out what you can control, which is yourself.
Wow. So let's talk about this week's news that Rappler was involved in. So yesterday, Facebook's head of security, Nathan Gleicher, announced that Facebook had shut down some accounts, pages, and groups originating from China. So we all heard about the Russian interference with, the American election and before that in Ukraine. And it looks like China is now taking a page from that and getting involved in messing with other countries' elections and governance. And one of the people who they were backing, just like they backed Trump in America, was Duterte, the leader of the Philippines, who is your prosecutor, and you've investigated him. Now, did Rappler had a hand in locating these groups, these organized groups to circulate misinformation, didn't they? Can you tell us about that?
So Facebook, about this time, 24 hours ago, they announced that they would take down 2 influence operations. And what I mean by influence operations is, state. In this particular case, both looked state-sponsored, but you in a closed system, you feed lies. And the end goal of all of that is to change the minds, to change the way people think, so they change the way they act. There were 2. The first was Chinese influence operations. They originated from Fujian. And then the second were Philippine domestic influence operations that were linked by Facebook to the police and military. We had a hand in the domestic one, the police and military, because we were quite alarmed by the inciting to hate, inciting to violence against human rights activists, lawmakers, journalists, and given the anti-terror law that was just passed, where anyone designated a terrorist can be arrested without a warrant and held for up to 24 days, we felt that we had brought this up. We did the stories and then brought it up to Facebook. I think the second one, the Chinese operations, are interesting for me because we started seeing these accounts filtering in a year ago. And one of the interests, of course, you can look at the report now, but it shows you that this network, the Chinese influence operations, were focused not just on the Philippines, but on Southeast Asia, Taiwan, Indonesia. They were most successful in the Philippines. And in the Philippines, they were pro-Duterte, pro-Marcos. They focused on content on the South China Sea, which is deeply contentious. And then finally, of course, this is a network that attacked me personally. I mean, it's kind of good to know that, well, we knew this from the data, but I was just going to be glib and say, so now China comes in to also join the attacks that are state-sponsored here. So it is exactly what we have seen from 4 years ago. It's just, as usual, from Russian disinformation, it spreads. Chinese disinformation is now evolved. has been affected by that. And that, while it's great that Facebook took it down, there is a lot more that needs to be taken down.
One thing that was interesting that came out from Facebook, I think in his post, Gleitcher said it wasn't the content of the posts which violated Facebook policy, but just the idea that they were from these inauthentic networks. So basically, some of the content just attacked you directly. And what he was saying is, gee, that's okay. You think after all this time, Facebook would maybe look at their policies and say, is it okay for a policy to be personally attacking not just prominent journalists like yourself, but anyone with such lies? Are these parts of discussions that you've had with Facebook?
Yeah, Stephen. I mean, your book actually shows all of the difficulties that Facebook has had with this. I think that they continue to duck responsibility as a publisher. They don't want to be called a publisher, even though in a way they are. I mean, to all intents and purposes, Facebook is the world's largest distributor of news, right? But look, the reason we at Rappler also don't just look at the content, because that's a whack-a-mole game. Right. And it's much easier to think about it. The work that we did with counterterrorism before actually helped infuse the way we gather data and the way we look at networks of disinformation, because I don't want to get distracted by misinformation. And I also wonder why Americans always use misinformation versus disinformation. It is very clear there are networks that are meant to manipulate us. And those are the ones like terrorism we should take down. So that's kind of the way Facebook has dealt with the network. Is they came up with this definition, CIB, coordinated inauthentic behavior, right? But the problem is that this definition maybe would have worked 4 years ago in 2016, when the information ecosystem, the influence operations coming in started. Right. Well, it started earlier than that. It started in 2014. But anyway, now 4 years into it, like in the Philippines, the attacks are constant for 4 years. These types of exponential, when lies laced with anger and hate spread faster and further than facts, those lies are part of these information operations. They change the way people think. So 4 years later, real people think this now. I mean, real accounts. So how do you deal with that? I think that's a failure in terms of how Facebook thinks about this, because the influence operations have fundamentally changed the ecosystem. Democracy is weaker everywhere around the world, including in your country.
Yeah, I want to talk about that in a second. And we've certainly seen that it's an attack on truth. But since the Philippines are a little ahead of this on this, I wonder, as a journalist, you do this great investigative journalism, but does it get to a point where the audiences that you want to present that journalism to just won't be affected by it because they won't believe anything?
And that's the goal. And I think we are there. This is the problem. And that's the root. That's the core of Russian disinformation, right? And that, I think, was a basic understanding that Facebook didn't have. I mean, they brought in a lot of people in 2018, but it was quite late in the game. I mean, the attacks against me began in 2016. Journalist equals criminal, right? And look at how it went, where it went in 2020. There are Filipinos who believe I'm a criminal, and yet I haven't done anything differently. But the information ecosystem was fundamentally changed by social media platforms. So, so the goal of Russian disinformation is not to make you believe in anything, but to destroy your trust in everything. And that includes why are journalists attacked, why are news organizations attacked, because we bring the facts. We still hold power to account. I would say in the last 4 years, the journalists have done their jobs. We continue to do that, even when it's become far more dangerous to do so. Same in the United States, right? But the problem is that when the information ecosystem is so chaotic, and when the distribution system prioritize lies over facts, prioritizes anger and hate over rational thinking, then you're left with a democracy where people can't tell fact from fiction. That means you don't have facts, you can't have truth, you can't have trust. How can you have a democracy if you have no integrity of facts? How can you have integrity of markets? And then how can you have integrity of elections, right? So having said that, we saw the reports start to come out, the research reports start to come out as early as 2017. And, we felt the attacks in 2016. So globally in 2017, I think it was Freedom House that said that in at least 27 countries around the world, cheap armies on social media was rolling back democracy. A year later, in 2018, that was almost doubled by Oxford University's Computational Propaganda Research Project. And then in 2019, it was more than 72 countries. And who knows, right? What we've seen with the coronavirus is that power has consolidated power. They're automatically given greater power because of the virus. And in countries like mine, Hungary, Brazil, all of a sudden government gets authoritarian style populist leaders get far more power and far more money.
So in 2016, it's something, an anecdote that I tell in my book, Facebook, The Inside Story. You warned Facebook about this. You said, this is happening right now in the Philippines, and it could be happening in the United States. It could even elect Donald Trump. And everyone laughed because that seems so absurd. Do you feel that in that time, because it was a few years that Facebook had been getting these complaints, Facebook understood it and was turning a blind eye, or they hadn't understood it at that point? And the second part of the question would be, do they really understand it now?
So I think in 2016, they didn't understand it because so you know this better. Actually, Stephen, I should ask you. They put the growth people in charge, right? You would know that better. They put engineers who were, and the word is optimizing. So they were optimizing to manipulate us, to keep us on the platform, and also optimizing for money, the micro-targeting. I actually always say that today, the social media platforms are behavior modification systems because they take everything we put in, they use machine learning to build the models of us, and then they take our most vulnerable moment to a message and they sell that to the highest bidder. That micro-targeting makes it extremely potent, and that bidder can be a government or a company. And I don't think this is advertising in the old sense. Anyway, I'm sorry I got derailed, but I guess the first part of that is that in 2016, they may not have known completely, but they got repeated warnings. I was very personal. I gave them Excel sheets of stuff. And the conversation that you talked about was in 2016. In 2017, I did get to talk to Mark Zuckerberg, to Sheryl Sandberg. I brought up that the Philippines, in fact, I invited Mark to come visit the Philippines to see how powerful Facebook is. Facebook is our internet here, 100%.
Yeah, did he take up your invitation? Did he take up your invitation?
No. The way he dealt with it was, he was just starting the travel through the U.S. because he was just realizing how little he knew, right? You know this better than I do because you sat in so many interviews with him. But, he struck me as a bright young man, young because I'm much older than he, but bright, but had never lived outside the United States. And I told him, I said, Mark, 97, at that point it was 97% of Filipinos on the internet are on Facebook. Facebook is our internet. And then he just looked at me, and this was like maybe about 10 or 11, no more than a dozen of us. And then he just said, wait, Maria, where are the other 3%? Well, he got the other 3% in the succeeding years. And I laughed at that point in time, but now it's just, looking at these influence operations, this is insidious manipulation of us. And I guess that's my question is, how can do we have free will? That's one. The second is, and this is something that the Chinese influence operations do. They were the posts that they posted against me were inciting hate, inciting violence, degrading you so that you're not a human being. These things are extremely dangerous. And we've seen the violence erupt in countries like Myanmar, where the UN sent a fact-finding group, and Facebook sent its own, and they determined that genocide happened. Gosh,
Anyway,
Stephen, we can talk about so many things. Yeah, I guess.
Let me ask you a
what do you? Are you hopeful?
Me? Well, I mean, I'm disturbed. I'm disturbed at what's happening in the Philippines and in America. But I want to say asking something positive. We have a question from our audience that maybe we could finish on more of an upbeat note. So, what is Justin Slutsky asks? What is an achievable positive change that could be made in the world in the next 5 years?
So I'm going to so many things that I would love to happen, but if I could wave a magic wand, enlighten self-interest for Facebook. It's so strange because I was just talking to some of the folks there, they have tremendous power, but it's the abdication of the use of the power. They don't want, Mark has said this, you don't want Facebook being the arbiter of free speech. I feel every time I hear that, and every time I hear a Facebook rep say that, I always think, good God, get over yourselves. You already are. And the choices that you have made have destroyed democracy and put people like me in extreme danger, and has killed people. Because the problem is that the global South, our countries, are the ones that bear the brunt of Silicon Valley's decisions. So a positive thing, number one, I guess, Facebook is asking for regulations. Regulations take time. I hope enlightened self-interest happens, that Facebook does things like what it just did 24 hours ago. Take down these networks of disinformation that are fomenting hate, that are spreading lies, that are meant to kill democracy. That's one. And it isn't just Facebook. It's these kinds of designs, the algorithms that create a loop, that manipulate us. These things are embedded in every social media platform, right? It's just Facebook is the world's largest distributor of news. I think that's one. The second is, can the world please come together? We're watching the UN General Assembly on the 75th year, right? But 75 years ago, the atom bomb went off, the end of World War II, the end of fascism. And now it looks like we're on the cusp of returning to fascism if we cannot solve this problem that was created by moving fast and breaking things, right? So, we talk about this all the time because I go, Stephen, please tell me, give me hope. I put a lot of hope and faith still in Facebook. We can't put the genie back in the bottle. And I'm just hoping that they move fast enough and do not wait for legislation. Having said that, they ask for it. So yes, we need laws. We need to come together beyond the laws and treat it like we did post-World War II. The world came together to prevent humanity from destroying itself. And that's when we created the UN right. Declaration of Human Rights. Right. So this is another one of those moments. We need to do this, and this protects our lives and our democracies.
Well, I asked you for positive, and you gave me atom bombs and fascisms, Maria. But you are the inspiration.
Positive. You're the hope. It is positive.
Anyway, I want to thank you so much. You can go to sleep now. And WIRED25 thanks you, and best of luck to you.
To you too. Thanks.
Well, that was fascinating. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Maria. And in that conversation, I was reminded of something that was a thread through all of the conversations today. And it's one of the things that interests me most about technology. And it's that in technology and science, there's frequent compounding, right? As Maria Ressa said, power consolidates power because of network effects, because of economies of scale. When something starts moving in one direction, it tends to move ever faster in that direction, right? Authoritarian governments overwhelm social networks, which helps empower authoritarian governments, which can then overwhelm social networks. Climate change leads to changes in the biology of the Arctic. It leads to more climate change, leads to more changes in the biology of the Arctic. A VC ecosystem with a narrow focus narrows the focus of the VC ecosystem. So what tends to happen is if things start going in the wrong way, they continue that way. But what's interesting and what's important about this conversation is that the reverse is also true. When things start getting better, when democracy becomes empowered, things can start going in the right direction with the same compounding effects, the same economies of scale. So that's one of the great things about tech. If you can set things in the right direction, things get better. And so that's what I felt like was the biggest theme of the conversations today. People working as hard as they could to make things go in the right direction again. So thank you to everybody who spoke. Thank you to our fabulous Wired moderators. And thank you to our sponsor, Vonage. Vonage is bringing people together globally. And thanks to their support, helping us create a richer WIRED25 experience. We've now done 2 out of 3. The last one is next Wednesday. And it's all about the Wired superheroes of 2020. So we call the scientists, hackers, journalists, policymakers, really protecting us during the pandemic. So we'll hear from Dr. Anthony Fauci. You probably know who he is. You can check Twitter if you want to see his latest and greatest conversations with Rand Paul. We'll hear from Audrey Tang, Taiwan's digital minister. Taiwan has a dense population. It's about 25% larger than New York. And they've suffered 7 deaths from coronavirus. And that's partly thanks to the work of Tang and of open democracy and digital democracy. We'll also hear from the CTI League of Volunteer Hackers defending the healthcare sector, COVID exploiting cyber criminals. We're going to hear from journalist Patrice Peck, newsletter Coronavirus News for Black Folks. We're going to talk to the 17-year-old who built a coronavirus tracker. We're going to talk to people securing our elections. We'll wrap up the day with a timely session about the fires in the western United States and what we can do about them. Afterwards, we'll also do deeper dive with speaker meetups after the program, so stay tuned for those. They'll be announced on Monday. Registered attendees will be able to pick the ones they want to go to. If you signed up for a speaker meetup today, Zooms are starting right now. Topics are documenting the canaries in our environmental coal mine, virtual reality fosters actual empathy, and what's the difference between Fortnite and Facebook from a UX strategy. So thank you so much. We'll see you next week.